So in 1973, there was this social experiment done where participants started out looking at pairs of paintings, and they would select which one that they preferred. And then at this point, they were assigned into specific groups. And a selection of those participants were told that they were assigned to the group that they were assigned to because of their selections. Another of the batch of them were told they were assigned to a group by a coin toss. So just arbitrarily, we flipped a coin and you're in a group. They don't know about this other group. They're just told different things. And then as a control, other participants weren't told anything about being in a group because there was no actual group activity. They were all just given a code number, but that code number that they were given obscured their identity and who they were, but it did indicate what group they were in. Of course, the people that weren't told there were groups wouldn't have realized this for the control group. But the other groups knew they were either assigned to a group because of their choices of the paintings they liked or by the coin toss, and they knew what group they were in. And then they were led as individuals into a cubicle. And then in that cubicle, they were told, all right, you're able to take this little booklet and you can assign real money, like real money that other participants are going to leave with by marking it down in this booklet. And so the identities are concealed, but the code does indicate what group each of the individuals is in. And this study was designed because researchers were trying to look into in-group bias. And they wanted to figure out, like, would people be more generous to their group even when they're told that their groups were decided randomly? Or would the effect only appear where participants felt like they had, because of the preference for the paintings, maybe they had something in common with their group mates or with the people in their group? So the results showed that people gave more money to their group members, to the in-group, regardless of why that group had been formed in the first place. People were more generous with their in-group, even when they had been assigned by a coin toss. And experiments that follow this same basic outline, this is called the minimal group paradigm. They've been repeated time and time again, demonstrating that the favoritism that people show to their own group doesn't need to be founded on anything that means anything. It's not particularly meaningful. In-group bias and prejudice, they're like, it shows up in humans from a very early age. Actually, children as young as 3 show this in-group favoritism. And then with studies that were done with kids from like ages 5 to 8, so slightly older, found that just like the adults, kids showed bias regardless of how the groups were selected, even when they were not based on anything meaningful at all. So have you guys heard the term othering? Have you guys used that term? Have you heard that term? By the way, I love this. So I can't say it's my favorite like word, just on like aesthetics, like it's a weird word. But it seems to be the hot new word in academic circles. And, first we had other, and then we had like other with a capital O. And then now we have othering as like a verb, as a thing that gets done. Well, it's not the most aesthetically pleasing word, and I wish I had like a better word. I guess alienating maybe would be a good other word. But I do get what the term othering is doing, and I think it's an extremely valuable thing to attempt to name succinctly this sinful dynamic. The process of turning a fellow human being into a foreigner, an alien, a stranger, or labeling as not one of us. In a single word, othering names something that is at the very heart of sin. And it's everywhere. We do it constantly. Like in the studies we just discussed, time after time, participants showed favoritism toward their group, knowing full well that their group was formed by nothing more than a coin toss. Think about that. Othering needs nothing more than a coin toss to begin doing its work in us. Now imagine how that scales up when we start thinking about skin color and language differences and religion and politics. So today is Pentecost. It's the celebration of the events of Acts 2 when God pours his Spirit out upon humanity and the sign of the inbreaking of the kingdom. What is that sign? What is the sign of signs? The kingdom of God. I'd suggest that the kingdom is marked by an assault on othering. Where othering has vanished, the kingdom has come. And whenever I hear this story, when I see this move of the Spirit to overcome the things that separate us and alienate us, the deepest of these, like being our ability to communicate with one another, I can't help but consider how Pentecost echoes back to that primordial story of the Tower of Babel, where human hubris is thwarted in the creation of these very language differences, the barriers between the nations. Genesis 11, we heard read, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. And as men moved eastward, they found the plain of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we can make a name for ourselves.'" And God comes down to see the city and the tower and the men that are building. And he's like, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. And so he confuses them in their language, and the Lord scatters them, and they stopped building the city. What would it have been like to live in Babel in the days after its destruction? Now, the text does not say that God destroyed the tower, but in many popular renderings of the story, this is exactly what happened. So let's hold that dramatic image in our minds. People wandering amid the ruins, unable to communicate, condemned to mutual incomprehension. Now, I want to share a bit of work of another social psychologist and author named Jonathan Haidt, who's a Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University Stern School of Business. So his main area of study is actually called it's in the realm of psychology of morality and moral emotion. His main contribution scientific contribution from the psychological field is called the moral foundations theory. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's really fascinating work, and there's a book called The Righteous Mind that delves into that a little bit that I would recommend checking out. But Eric and I got to go hear this guy speak at the Tampa Theater just over a year ago, and he shared his concerns about the effects of social media on our collective psychology. He's actually currently working on a book, and the title of that book is going to be Life After Babel. So during his talk, he bemoaned the time that it takes to write a book and publish it, because he felt that I'm trying to sound an alarm here, and it's just going to take too damn long to get this book out. So he was giving some talks, and he said, this was 10 days after this, he says, I'm going to put an article out with this main argument in the Atlantic in 10 days. And 10 days later, this article came out, Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. And the article opens with a retelling of the Tower of Babel story. And Jonathan argues that this story is the best metaphor that he has found for what happened in America in the 2010s and for the fractured country that we now inhabit. Something, he says, went terribly wrong, very suddenly. We're disoriented and unable to speak the same language or recognize the same truth. We're cut off from one another and from our past. And it's been clear for quite a while now that you have like red America and blue America becoming like two different countries that inhabit the same territory. Two different versions of the Constitution and economics and American history. But Babel is not a story about tribalism. It's a story about fragmentation of everything. It's about the shattering of all that had seemed solid. The scattering of people that had been a community. It's a metaphor for what is happening not only between red and blue, but within the left. It's happening within the right. It's happening within the universities, within our companies, within our churches, within our families. Babel, for Haidt, is a metaphor for what some forms of social media have done to nearly all groups and institutions that he argued are the most important for the country's future to us as a people. Another author, Robert Wright, in his book Non-Zero, has argued that there's a direction to history and that it's toward cooperation at larger scale. So Wright showed that history involves a series of transitions driven by rising population density and new technology. So you have writing, you have roads, you have printing press, kind of big deals in the changes that took place. But that they emerged new possibilities for mutually beneficial trade and learning. So kind of the idea of win-win, or what he called non-zero-sum games. And so this would be the overlap area, the area of overlapping interests. He's like, there's actually something that can be, and he illustrates this in let's say biological evolution, from single cell to multicellular to a bee to a beehive. And he's like, but then we develop these brains. And then there's social, cultural evolution too. And so he starts illustrating with that. And he's like, this is actually kind of a trajectory of history. Now, just to flesh this out a little bit, because he's contrasting it with zero-sum games, which you may be familiar with, but in case you're not, it is, I win, I have an ice cream, you don't have an ice cream. You lose, I have an ice cream, you don't have an ice cream. Just to kind of finish out that. But in the early stages of the internet, some of you may remember this experience, in let's say the 1990s, the early internet with its chat rooms and its message boards and email exemplified the non-zero thesis, as did the wave of the first social media platforms that were launched around 2013. And you guys remember this guy? So this was MySpace, and we had Friendster, and Facebook made it easy to connect with friends and some strangers to talk about our common interests for free and at a scale never before imagined. And then by 2008, Facebook had emerged as the dominant platform with more than 100 million monthly users. By the way, today that's 3 billion. Well, just under 3 billion. But in the first decade of the new century, social media was widely believed to be a boon for democracy. This was a big deal. What dictator could impose his will on an interconnected citizenry? What regime could build a wall to keep out the internet? So Haidt suggests that the high point of techno-democratic optimism was 2011, which, by the way, 2011, some of you guys know I have a time cover thing, this is one among them that is no longer on my wall, but 2011, the person of the year, they always have a person, wasn't a person, it was a people, the protester. This was 2011, a year that began with the Arab Spring and ended with a global Occupy movement. Interestingly enough, that's also the year that we basically, all of us had, Google Translate became available on virtually all smartphones. So you could say that 2011 was the year that humanity rebuilt the Tower of Babel. We were closer than we had ever been to being one people, and we had effectively overcome the curse of our division by language. And for the techno-democratic optimists, it seemed like this was only the beginning for what humanity could do. And then in February of 2012, as Mark Zuckerberg prepared to take Facebook public, he wrote a letter to potential investors in the IPO. And it's worth reading. I wish I could read the whole thing to you, but just here's a taste. Today, our society has reached another tipping point. So he's talking about tipping points before that. So he's talking about the printing press. Things have made major shifts. There's societal tipping points where everything really changes. And he says, our society's reached another one of those. And in the letter to the investors, he says, Facebook hopes to, this is a quote, to rewire the way that people spread and consume information by giving them power to share. And it will help them to once again transform many of our core institutions and industries. And in the 10 years since then, a little 10 plus years since then, Zucks has done exactly what he said he would do. They have rewired the way that we spread and consume information. It has transformed our institutions, and it has pushed us past a tipping point. if you read the vision he casts in there, I don't think it's worked out exactly the way that he had envisioned, though. And by 2013, social media had become a new game. I mean, it was a game with dynamics. They were very different than the one that existed in 2008. So if you were skillful at it, or if you were lucky, you might post something and go viral. You might be internet famous for a few days. And if you blundered, you could find yourself buried in hateful comments. Your posts would ride to fame or to shame based on clicks of thousands of strangers. And then you, in turn, contributed thousands of clicks to the game. And the new game encouraged dishonesty, and it encouraged mob dynamics. Actually, his name is Chris Wetherell, was one of the engineers at Twitter, basically the dude that built the retweet button. He later would go on to regret his contribution because he said that it made Twitter a nastier place. And he did an interview with BuzzFeed in which he said, reflecting on one particular mob of trolls, he said this: it was very easy for them to brigade reputational harm on someone they didn't like. Ask any of the people that were their targets at the time. Retweeting helped get a false picture of that person out faster, much faster than they could respond. Because we didn't build a defense for that. We only built an offensive conduit. He said it was a creeping horror story for me. And then he said it dawned on me that this was not a small subset of people acting aberrantly? Is that how you say that word? This is not a subset of people acting aberrantly. This might be how people behave. And that scared me to death, he said. And as he watched the mobs form, and in this interview, he said to himself, we might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon, which, by the way, became the title of this interview that he did with BuzzFeed. And Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist I was referring to, who studies emotion and morality and politics, said he saw this happening too. These newly tweaked platforms, he says, were almost perfectly designed to bring out our most moralistic and least reflective selves. And the volume of outrage was shocking. Our most moralistic and our least reflective selves. It sounds like religious fervor, doesn't it? Anyway, in the BuzzFeed article, Wetherell says, Twitter from that moment became an anger video game. Tweets were the points. And that reminded me of a video that I want to share with you. By the way, the video is called This Video Will Make You Angry. It's probably a little longer than I would like in terms of an illustration, but it's just too damn good. So hopefully Michael's up there and can make the volume right. But I'm going to go ahead and play this video for you. We'll take a few minutes. Hopefully you enjoy this as much as I do. This is do you guys know, I get the letters mixed up. CGP Grey? CGP Grey, I think is his name on YouTube. Anyways, he's one of my favorite YouTubers, been around for a while. But this is a sample of his video. This video will make you angry.
Hello, Internet. Thoughts compete for space in your brain. Cat photos, news stories, belief structures, funny GIFs, educational videos, not so educational videos, and your thinking inventory is limited. A thought without a brain, to think it dies. Now, we can treat thoughts as though they're alive, specifically alive like germs. That might sound weird, but stick with me. Take jokes. Jokes are thought germs that live in your brain, and when you tell the joke to another brain, you help it to reproduce, just like when you have the flu and sneeze to help it reproduce. This germ gets into its host by snot through the mouth, and this one by words through the ear, but it's reproduction either way. Logging onto your social media then is exposing yourself to everyone's mental sneezes, each post a glob of snot with a thought germ trying to get into your brain. If not for permanent residents, then at least long enough to get you to press the share button and sneeze it with everyone you know. In this analogy then, a funny cat photo with the perfect caption is a superflu. Now, just as germs exploit weak points in your immune system, so do thought germs exploit weak points in your brain, aka emotions. Once inside, thought germs that press emotional buttons get their host to spread them more, measurably more. Well, except sadness. Sad thoughts don't get very far. Awe is pretty good, which is why websites that construct thought germs like biological weapons arm them with titles like 7 whatevers that will blow your mind or the shocking secret behind this thing. But anger is the ultimate edge for a thought germ. Anger bypasses your mental immune system and compels you to share it like nothing else. Being aware of your brain's weak spots is necessary for good mental health, like knowing how to wash your hands. Because even without intentional construction, any thought germ on the internet can, on its own, grow more infectious as it spreads. To talk about why, let's forget anger for a moment and go back to that cat photo. Every photo ever taken is a thought germ, and most die a quick death like the bazillion cat photos, or baby photos, posted on the internet that are never shared. But a mildly funny cat photo can grow into so much more, because just as transatlantic flights were the best thing to happen to germs, so the internet is the best thing to happen to thought germs. For once on board, that cat photo can leap into other brains, and those brains might share it, and here's the key point, occasionally change it. A Photoshop here, a tweaked caption there. Most changes are terrible, but some make the thought germ even funnier, getting more brains to share it, which results in more changes and a shot at superstardom. Thus, a lowly cat photo can achieve global brain domination, at least for a few hours. The internet, with its unparalleled ability to share and randomly change thought germs, can't help but make them stronger. With jokes, that's awesome, but with angry germs, not always so awesome, no. Angry germs, the more they're shared, undergo the same process, changing and distorting to be more aggravating. These have a better chance of spreading than their possibly more accurate, but probably also more boring, rivals. But like plagues, thought germs can burn through a population too quickly. Just watch your favorite meme-generating machine for a week and you'll see the life cycle fly by. However, some thought germs have found a way around burnout. Now, I must warn you, depending on which thought germs live in your head and which you fight for, the next section might sound horrifying. So please keep in mind, we're talking about what makes some thought germs successful, particularly angry ones, and not how good or how bad the thoughts themselves are. Deep breath, calm. Thought germs can burn out because once everyone agrees, it's hard to keep talking and thus thinking about them. But if there's an opposing thought germ, an argument, then the thinking never has to stop. The disagreement doesn't have to be angry, but again, angry helps. The more visible an argument gets, the more bystanders it draws in, which makes it more visible, which is why every group from the most innocuous internet forum to the national conversation can turn into a double rage storm across the sky in no time. Wait, these thought germs aren't competing, they're cooperating. Working together, they reach more brains and hold their thoughts longer than they could alone. Thought germs on opposite sides of an argument can be symbiotic. One tool symbiotic anger germs in particular can employ is you're with us or against us. Whatever thought germ does left to the front of your brain, push it back. This video isn't about that. We're just talking about this tool, which makes it very hard for neutral brains to resist, and its divisiveness also grows its symbiotic partner. This explains why in some arguments gaining more allies also gains more enemies. Because though the participants think they're involved in a fiery battle to the death, from the anger germ's perspective, one side is a field of flowers and the other a flock of butterflies. Of course planting more flowers will get you more butterflies, and getting more butterflies will pollinate more flowers. If there is some argument that splits the population and lasts forever and that even the most neutral people find difficult to avoid, you just might be looking at a super successful pair of symbiotic anger germs that have reached ecological stability. Now, one final depressing thought, one more awe-inspiring point that will reveal the secrets of actually no, it's just depressing. When opposing groups get big, they don't really argue with each other, they mostly argue with themselves about how angry the other group makes them. We can actually graph fights on the internet to see this in action. Each becomes its own quasi-isolated internet sharing thoughts about the other. You see where this is going, right? Each group breeds thought germs about the other, and as before, the most enraging, but not necessarily the most accurate, spread the fastest. The group almost can't help but construct a totem of the other so enraging they'll talk about it all the time, which, now that you know how thought germs grow, is exactly what makes the totem always perfectly maddening. Now, all this isn't to say there's no point in arguing. That's a different video. Or that the internet isn't amazing, or that there aren't things worth trying to change people's minds minds about. Thought germs of all kinds come and go. But it's useful to be aware of how thoughts can use our emotions to spread, and how the more rapidly a thought is able to spread, the more chances it has to become even better at spreading through random changes that are made to it. Sometimes that's great, sometimes it's terrible. But if you want to maintain a healthy brain, it pays to be cautious of thoughts that have passed through a lot of other brains and that poke you where you're weakest. It's your brain. Be hygienic with it.
The line that really stood out to me in there, if you were able to follow, was when opposing groups get really big, they don't really argue with each other. They mostly argue amongst themselves about how angry the other group makes them. We have allowed othering, which happens quite naturally, as we saw in the psychological research that we opened with this morning, to alienate us from one another so that we no longer speak the same language at all. Not only do we not speak to each other, we can't. God has so confused our languages that we now stand among the rubble of crumbling institutions, doubting history, and unable to communicate, condemned to mutual incomprehension. But the good news of Pentecost is that God does not leave humanity in this condition where othering flourishes. God's plan is to pull humans back into solidarity, but this time in a redeemed state under the lordship of the Lamb. So in Pentecost, the confusion of the curse of Babel and the sins of othering are reversed. The kingdom is marked by an assault on othering. Where othering has vanished, the kingdom has come. And so we read in Acts 2, when the day of Pentecost came, they were together in one place, and suddenly a sound like blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. And they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in tongues as the Spirit enabled them. When they heard the sound, the crowd came together in bewilderment because each of them heard their own language being spoken. And utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't those guys all Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." And amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" And then Peter stands up, as he does many times throughout the beginning of the book of Acts. And he says, "This is what is spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God said, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. And even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And the event of Pentecost, which can be re-experienced every day as the Spirit continues to prompt Christian communities to overcome othering in the midst of their relationships personally, overcome othering locally, nationally, internationally. This is a foretaste of the coming kingdom. Actually, in Revelation chapter 7, it says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. And they cried out together in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.' They fell down on their faces before the throne and they worshiped God, saying, 'Amen, praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen.'" And there's something that I just find fascinating, and I've been pondering throughout the week. Just here's like an aside kind of reflection for you. So God confuses their language. And then in Pentecost, the Spirit gives them the ability to transcend those differences. And then in the vision of the kingdom in Revelation, all of those languages are still present. You know, in Babel, they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we can make a name for ourselves." And in the second decade of this century, we said, "Come, let us rewire the way people spread and consume information by giving them the power to share, to help them once again transform many of our core institutions and industries. By sheer will and tech, we overcame the curse of confusion with our social networks, and with Google Translate on our phones, we built a tower of hubris, and it crumbled. And we are living in a kind of post-Babel reality once again. Rubble and confusion and strife, and we are scattered. A great cloud of othering has descended upon us, and we so desperately need the fire of Pentecost once again. So I want to close today by reading the words of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 12, you heard read this morning. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To one there is given the Spirit, given through the Spirit a message of wisdom, and to another a message of knowledge by means of that same Spirit, and to another faith by that same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by that one Spirit, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and still another interpretation of tongues. All of these are work of one and the same Spirit, and He distributes them to each one as He determines. Just as a body, though one has many parts, but all in many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jew or Gentile, slave or free, red or blue, gay or straight, tall or short, Catholic or Protestant. We were all given one Spirit to drink. And where othering has vanished, the kingdom has come. Jesus, forgive us and heal us. And I echo that prayer that you prayed for your church in John 17, that we may be one, just as you and the Father are one. And on the night He was betrayed, He took bread and broke it and gave it to His disciples. And He said, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body that has been given for you." And in the same way, after supper, He took the cup and He poured it. "This is my blood shed for you and for all, so that sins may be forgiven. Take this, eat, and drink in remembrance of me."